The snow was endless, the winds merciless, yet man endured. In the frozen silence of the Ice Age, survival was not a choice but a daily battle, and every breath was borrowed against the cold. Fire gave warmth, the hunt gave food, but even these were not enough. To step outside the cave, to face the storm, to walk through endless snow, man needed a second skin, clothing. This is the story of how cavemen, with no tools but stone and bone, with no teachers but hunger and winter, learned to turn the hides of beasts into shields of warmth, how they stitched survival into every seam, how they carried not only their bodies, but the spirit of humanity across the freezing ages. This is not just a tale of hides and furs. It is the story of endurance, of invention, of how clothing saved mankind from the jaws of ice. When the world turned white, and merciless winds howled across endless plains, when snow fell, not for days, but for moons, blanketing earth in silence and hunger, the caveman learned quickly that his bare flesh was too fragile, too soft, too weak to endure. And so the story of clothing began not as art or ornament, but as raw survival, a second skin torn from the beasts that walked beside him and against him in the frozen wilderness. At first, the use of animal skins was crude, unshaped, and heavy, yet in those clumsy drapings lay the seed of humanity's greatest protection. After a hunt, when the blood of prey still steamed against the snow and the fire crackled low, the cavemen did not simply see food in the fallen beast. They saw warmth, warmth hidden in the fur that had allowed the wolf to stalk in blizzards, the bear to sleep through storms, the bison to stand unmoved in howling winds. They stripped the skins with stone blades, pulling away hide from flesh, heavy and raw, often still damp with blood, then draped it across their shoulders or wrapped it around their waists, tying with strips of sinew. These first garments were stiff, pungent, and unshaped, but in the grip of winter, even the rank smell of animal fat was a blessing compared to the icy kiss of the wind. Slowly, trial and error taught them that thicker hides meant longer survival. Wolf pelts kept hunters warm on the move, while mammoth hides, though enormous and cumbersome, could be stretched across sleeping bodies like blankets, keeping families alive through nights that would have frozen them solid. In the beginning, hides cracked quickly in the cold, stiffened like stone, and so the cavemen learned to keep them close to fire, softening them with smoke, rubbing them with grease, scraping with sharpened bone until they grew pliable. These discoveries were not inventions in sudden flashes of brilliance, but born of relentless necessity. Each experiment a gamble between life and death, each failure paid for in frost-bitten flesh, each success becoming tradition. To clothe oneself in the skin of another creature was more than protection. It was a strange communion, a borrowing of strength, as though the warmth of the beast continued in death to live on in man. Hunters wrapped wolf pelts around their shoulders to carry the endurance of the wolf, wore bear hides to take on the beast's strength, lay beneath bison skins to inherit its resilience against the storm. And yet this act was not simple theft, but reverence, for each hide came at the cost of life, and so rituals began. Some tribes left bones in the snow as offerings. Others spoke words into the wind, thanking the spirit of the beast for its gift. Over time, clothing became more than a barrier against the cold. It became memory, culture, identity, binding man not only to his own survival, but to the lives of the animals he depended upon. Each winter demanded more hides, more patience, more skill, and so the cavemen became craftsmen of necessity, learning how to strip, stretch, scrape, and smoke until hide became supple and fur remained thick, learning that without this second skin, no fire and no shelter would be enough. In the frozen silence of prehistory, where one wrong step meant death, clothing was not luxury. It was the difference between vanishing into snow or leaving behind footprints that would carry humanity forward. But raw hides alone could not last the full wrath of winter. For once, stripped from the beast, they stiffened, cracked, and rotted, becoming as brittle as ice itself. And so man, driven by hunger and the endless cold, discovered the long, patient art of taming leather. It began at the fireside, when hunters returned from the snow, dragging the carcass of their prey, not only to feast on its flesh, but to preserve its skin, for without preservation, the gift of warmth was fleeting. Around the crackling fire, the work began. Women, elders, and even children took part in scraping the hides with sharpened stones and bones, peeling away flesh and fat, hour after hour, until their hands were raw and their arms heavy. Yet the task was sacred, for every inch of softened skin was another layer of protection against the storm. They learned to rub fat into the hide, bear grease, bison tallow, marrow from broken bones, until the skin grew supple, bending instead of breaking, flexing with the movement of the body instead of turning rigid like bark. They discovered that smoke was another teacher, that hanging hides above smoldering embers infused them with strength, driving away insects, resisting decay, making them last through moons of snow and ice. This was no idle craft, but one born of desperation, for each hide prepared was the promise of a warm night, each softened pelt the shield of a child against the cruel breath of the wind. Slowly, this craft grew into knowledge. Certain fats worked better than others. Certain woods gave smoke that preserved longer. Certain stones scraped cleaner without tearing. It was a slow mastery carved by generations, a rhythm of survival where the hands of one season taught the next. The caveman began to realize that clothing was not simply draped skin, but shaped skin, worked until it moved like flesh, transformed until it became an extension of the human body itself. In this transformation, man discovered something profound, that survival lay not only in the brute force of the hunt, but in patience, labor, and ingenuity, that warmth could be created not just by fire, but by hands willing to shape the world. The taming of hides was more than a craft. It was the silent art of endurance, a partnership between fire, fat, and flesh. And through it, humanity carved a path across the frozen earth, one softened hide at a time. In the beginning, clothing was nothing but hides draped over shoulders, crude wrappings tied with sinew. But survival demanded more than clumsy layers, for hides slipped from the body in the wind, caught on branches in the forest, froze stiff when damp with snow. And so, necessity once again pushed man toward invention, and in the dim glow of cave fires, the first sparks of craftsmanship were born, sparks that would change forever how humanity dressed, moved, and endured. It began with tools, stone sharpened against stone until it was thin enough to pierce hide, bone splintered and ground to a point, teeth of animals used as awls, each object pressed again and again through tough leather until holes appeared, crude but functional. From these holes, strips of sinew or plant fiber were pulled, binding edges together, and so for the first time, hides could be joined, not merely draped, but shaped into coverings, that embraced the body, soon came refinement. Hunters realized that a thin bone, polished and drilled with a tiny hole at one end, could guide sinew like the modern needle, and this single discovery transformed clothing from a blanket into a garment. With bone needles, the caveman stitched hides into trousers that hugged the legs, tunics that freed the hands, moccasins that wrapped the feet, gloves that protected the fingers, and hoods that shielded the head, every piece tailored not for beauty, but for survival. For the first time, man could move freely while wrapped in warmth, could run through snow without garments slipping, could climb ice with hands protected from frostbite. These stitches, though uneven, though rough, were miracles, each one a line of defense against the winter. And yet the making of clothing was not only utility, but a gathering of memory. Every needle made from bone carried the echo of the beast it once belonged to. Every strip of sinew was drawn from the muscles of an animal that had once run. Every fur lining reminded the wearer of the life taken to give warmth. In this way, clothing was both shield and story, each garment carrying within it a history of the hunt, a memory of survival, and the sacred exchange between man and beast. As winters passed, the skill deepened. Women learned to stitch layers together, placing fur inside for softness and hide outside for strength, creating garments both warm and durable. Hunters decorated seams with carved bone beads or colored ochre, not for vanity, but for meaning, marking tribe, story, or spirit. Some tribes learned to cut hides into long strips, weaving them like baskets, layering for extra thickness, inventing new textures against the cold. The art of sewing became the heart of survival, a patient craft passed from hand to hand, fire to fire, generation to generation, until the skill itself was as vital as the hunt. For while fire warmed the body and meat filled the stomach, it was clothing that allowed man to walk into the storm, to climb mountains of ice, to follow prey across frozen plains, to endure the endless season without breaking. Without clothing shaped by stitch and seam, man would have been trapped in his cave, prisoner of the cold, but with it, he became a wanderer of winter, a conqueror of snow. And so, with each bone needle, with each patient seam of sinew, with each garment stitched by firelight, humanity stitched itself a future, weaving not only hides, but destiny, wrapping itself in the genius of invention and the will to endure. Clothing, once only the shield of flesh against the storm, slowly became something greater, something that reached beyond survival into the realm of meaning, memory, and identity. For as the caveman wrapped himself in hides, he did not only protect his body, but carried upon his skin the story of the hunt, the spirit of the beast, the bond of the tribe, and the voice of ancestors whispered through fur and sinew. Around the flickering firelight, when families huddled close against the roar of the blizzard outside, garments became symbols. The wolf pelt across the shoulders of a hunter was not just warmth, but a declaration of courage. For to wear the wolf was to claim its swiftness and cunning. The bear hide draped upon the elder was more than cloak. It was authority, strength, the heavy silence of wisdom carried in each strand of fur, the feathers tied along seams, the beads of carved bone stitched into edges, the ochre stains painted across leather. All these were not mere decorations, but language, unspoken signs of who a person was, what they had done, and where they belonged. In these early societies, clothing became the silent banner of identity, marking one tribe from another, one family from the next, the hunter from the gatherer, the child from the elder. Rituals began to bloom from these meanings. Before a great hunt, a man might wrap himself in the pelt of a wolf to summon the spirit of the predator. Before a child's first winter, mothers might stitch a garment from the hides of many animals, believing that the strength of each would guard the fragile body through the season. Before the burial of the dead, the body might be wrapped in furs, so that even in death the soul would not walk naked into the cold beyond. Each stitch became prayer. Each hide became offering. Each garment a bridge between the human and the sacred. Slowly, the cave itself became a place not only of shelter, but of culture, with walls painted not only with hunts, but with patterns of hides, with hands marked by dyes, that also marked clothing, with symbols carried not only in art, but on the very skins they wore. A cloak might bear ochre lines shaped like rivers, meaning the wearer had crossed great lands. A hood might carry the feathers of birds, meaning the hunter had taken to the skies in spirit. Moccasins lined with beads might whisper of journeys walked and survived. In this way, clothing transformed man from mere survivor to storyteller. Every seam a memory, every garment a living archive of the tribe's victories and losses. To strip a hide and stitch it into form was no longer only the act of fighting the cold. It was an act of reverence, an act of belonging, an act of saying, "We are here, we endured, and we remember." And though winters came with the same merciless weight, though the winds never softened, though snow covered the earth in silence, man walked out into that world, not only wrapped in warmth, but wrapped in meaning, carrying upon his shoulders not just the fur of beasts, but the spirit of his people. When the endless winters began to ease, and the grip of the Ice Age slowly loosened its hold on the earth, when glaciers began to retreat, and rivers once buried beneath ice awoke to flow again, it was not the naked body of man that stepped forward into this new world, but the clothed one, wrapped in the inventions, the crafts, the traditions, born of survival against the cold. For clothing was not a passing tool, but a legacy, one that had carried humanity across the brink of extinction into the dawn of history. Without hides, fur, sinew, and fire, man would have been swallowed by frost, his bones left buried beneath snow, forgotten like the beasts that perished around him. But with clothing, he had carved out endurance, shaped identity, and unlocked the power to wander farther than any animal dared. What began as crude drapings of bloody hide had over generations of necessity and ingenuity become garments shaped with care, stitched with bone needles, softened with fat, smoked with fire, and marked with meaning. And these garments allowed man to walk beyond caves, to cross frozen rivers, to climb mountains of ice, to chase prey into lands that no predator ruled. The first migrations out of the frozen north, the first steps into distant valleys and plains, the first settlements beyond the glaciers, all were made possible not only by fire and stone, but by clothing, the portable warmth that turned the human body into a traveler of worlds. Clothing became more than second skin. It became technology, a tool as vital as the spear, as transformative as fire. And with it came the seed of civilization itself. For once, man could endure the cold. He could explore, and once he could explore, he could connect, trade, and grow. Even as the earth warmed and seasons softened, the memory of those winters remained, stitched into every culture, passed down in garments, woven from plants, in robes dyed with color, in fabrics spun from fiber, all descendants of the first crude hides stitched by firelight. The legacy of caveman clothing was not only survival, but the birth of craft, the birth of creativity, the birth of identity expressed through fabric. What had once been the stiff, bloody hide of a wolf became thousands of years later the woven linen of Egypt, the silk of China, the wool of Europe, each step forward a transformation, yet all echoing that first desperate act of wrapping a body in skin against the storm. And even in the modern world, where winters are met with coats of fabric stitched by machines, where fashion fills the streets and culture turns clothing into art, the silent truth remains. Every garment we wear is a descendant of those first furs. Every thread owes its existence to the caveman crouched by fire, scraping hide with bone, stitching with sinew, praying against the storm. Clothing was not invention alone, but legacy, carved by survival, hardened by winter, softened by hands, and carried across millennia. It is the reason humanity endured the freezing silence of the Ice Age, the reason it walked beyond caves into history, the reason it stood not as fragile flesh but as a creature armored by its own creation. And so, the story of caveman clothing is not merely a story of the past. It is the foundation of the present, a reminder that every seam stitched today is stitched on the memory of those who first learned to wear the world upon their skin, who first conquered the cold with fur and fire, and who, by doing so, carried mankind out of the snow and into the future. Clothing began as survival, as hides draped against the wind, but as generations passed and the fires of humanity burned longer, it became something more than shield. It became social language, silent yet powerful, stitching people not only to warmth, but to one another. For when cavemen wore hides, they were no longer only protecting flesh, but signaling to eyes around them, shaping bonds, inspiring fear, drawing respect, and awakening desire. In the circle of the tribe, what a man or woman wore told a story before words could. The hunter who returned, cloaked in the pelt of a wolf, was admired not only for the meat he carried, but for the skill and courage stitched across his shoulders. The elder who draped himself in thick, bare fur spoke without speaking, his cloak declaring strength, wisdom, and authority more loudly than any cry. The woman whose garment was lined with feathers or beads, gathered from distant lands, became a symbol of connection, beauty, and allure. Her very presence a spark that bound families, alliances, and futures. In this way, clothing became the first mirror in which humanity saw itself reflected, not as individuals struggling alone against the storm, but as members of a tribe, bound by symbols, united by appearances, inspired by one another. Hierarchies were shaped in fur and sinew, for to wear rare hides was to hold rare power, and soon the tribe learned that clothing was not equal, but layered with meaning. The child wrapped in scraps of hide was innocent and fragile. The young hunter, draped in deer skin, was strong, but untested. The warrior in wolf's pelt was seasoned, and the elder in bear hide was untouchable, a living mountain of wisdom. Yet clothing also wove intimacy, for when a mother stitched a garment for her child, she did not only bind fibers, she bound care, protection, and love into every seam. When a man offered a pelt to a woman, it was not only warmth he gave, but a silent vow, a token of desire, of bond, of future. Around fire circles, when songs rose and shadows danced across cave walls, garments caught the glow, their furs shimmering, their beads glinting, their ochre lines glowing like spirits, turning each person into a figure, both human and symbolic. Clothing became the tribe's unspoken script, a language written in hides, each stitch a sentence, each pelt a paragraph, each garment a chapter of who they were. And so, society itself began to crystallize around clothing. Respect, attraction, authority, ritual, power, all carried not only in voices, but in the furs worn on the body. Without clothing, there was only the naked self, fragile and silent. With clothing, there was the social self, layered with meaning, armored with spirit, visible to all. This was humanity's second skin, not of flesh but of story, not of bone but of bond, and it was through this skin that tribes grew into communities, that families became lineages, that survival became culture. Clothing had begun as warmth, but by the time winters turned to seasons, it had become the very fabric of society, the silent force that made man not only survivor of the cold, but builder of civilization. Clothing, born of desperation, stitched in caves under dim firelight and hardened by the endless roar of winter, did not remain only the armor of survival, but grew, generation by generation, into the first measure of value, the first silent currency, the first spark of economy. For when one tribe saw the hides of another, when one hunter's cloak caught the eye of strangers across the snow, when one mother's stitching was admired beyond her family, the seed of exchange was planted, and humanity began to trade not only meat for meat, but fur for fire, hide for flint, garment for tool, until slowly the act of sharing became the act of bargaining, and clothing became wealth. Imagine the frozen valleys, where tribes met at the edges of hunting grounds, wary eyes watching, spears gripped tight, hunger in their bellies, and yet, beneath the tension, a different thought flickered. What if the thick bear skin draped over one man's shoulders could be traded for sharp obsidian blades? What if the fox furs bundled in one woman's arms could be given in return for salt carried from distant rivers? What if the soft leather, carefully scraped and tanned by one family, could be exchanged for dried meat gathered by another? It was in these moments that clothing transcended survival and became commodity, the first true object of human desire beyond the body itself. For hides did not rot quickly like meat, nor vanish in a single fire like wood. They lasted, endured, carried value across days, weeks, even seasons, and thus they became the perfect vessel of wealth, durable, portable, and symbolic. Soon tribes realized that the rarest pelts, the glossy black of raven feathers, the silver fur of wolves, the thick warmth of bear, were treasures, not only because they warmed, but because they spoke. They declared status, they drew eyes, they commanded respect, and to possess such garments was to carry power visible to all. In this way, clothing birthed a hierarchy not only within tribes, but between them, for those who controlled the furs of the land controlled the respect of others, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first economy of humanity was stitched from the skins of beasts. Fireside gatherings became markets. Cautious exchanges became traditions. The act of wrapping oneself in fur became inseparable from the act of declaring value, and this value passed from hand to hand, tribe to tribe, until routes of trade stretched farther than hunting grounds, until stories of rare pelts spread like whispers through valleys, until the search for fur led men not only to chase animals, but to seek out people, to seek out strangers, to seek out trade. Thus, the very need to clothe the body became the bridge between tribes, transforming fear into contact, suspicion into transaction, and slowly, slowly, into alliance. For in giving a garment, one did not only give warmth, but trust. In accepting one, did not only gain protection, but bond. And in this silent contract, the foundations of human economy were laid. The first traders were not merchants as we know them, but hunters and mothers, stitching hides by fire, scraping leather with patience, carrying bundles across frozen plains, offering their work in exchange for survival of another kind. In these moments, humanity discovered that value could be stored, carried, multiplied, and that to survive winter was no longer only about what you hunted or gathered, but what you could exchange. Out of this grew not only wealth, but connection. For trade meant journeys, journeys meant paths, paths meant memory, and memory meant the first maps of human migration, carved not into stone, but into footsteps. Footsteps guided by the desire for clothing. And so, from the silence of the Ice Age, a new sound rose. Not only the crack of spears or the howl of beasts, but the murmur of bargaining, the hum of exchange, the laughter of trade, the whispers of wealth measured in fur. This was the birth of economy, born not in gold, not in silver, not in coins, but in hides stitched by hands against the storm. And this birth carried humanity forward, carrying within it the same truth that began in the cave. Clothing was survival, but survival, when multiplied and exchanged, became wealth, and wealth became the foundation of civilization itself.